No long and convoluted intro for today's video. Let's get going quick. Film is analog. Digital, ones and zeros. With film, your image is stored on a piece of plastic film. With digital, it's on a memory card. Typically, film is slower and more deliberate. Digital is faster and much more convenient. With film, there's no ability to review your image in real time. With digital, you're able to chimp and look at the screen, which is really nice for beginners. With film, there's scarcity. You're limited to ever how many exposures you put in the camera. With digital and the cheap price of memory cards these days, you can shoot almost forever. With film, your images are not as malleable in post. With the huge dynamic range possessed by cameras these days, you can do almost anything with your images. So you're thinking about getting into film photography, it all starts with picking the right format. Whether you know it or not, there are all manner of sizes of film. Starting with really small formats like 110. Yes, there's still some new 110 format film out there still being made. And then you've got probably what's the most common film format, and that's 35mm film. We go into 120 or medium format film at that point. And then at the end, we have the massive, really expensive, larger formats, 4x5, 8x10, and so on. And there's quite a few considerations on the front end when you're picking your film format. First and foremost, you need to know whether they actually make the film that you want to buy in the format that you end up deciding to go with. When you're at 110 format, there's like 2 or 3 film stocks being made. Or with medium and large format, there isn't nearly as much choice with those formats as there is with 35mm. So 35mm being the most popular, there are the most options. If you're shooting something weird like 110 or large format, you're gonna have less options. But the more important consideration is how much you're willing to spend per shot. These days, there are 35mm cameras that split your exposures in 2. Half-frame cameras, we call them. Half-frame cameras will obviously make it much cheaper to shoot, and when you're just starting out, it makes it a really nice entry point. So you get 72 exposures rather than 36 on most rolls of 35mm film. So 72 exposures, half-frame cameras, really cheap. 8x10 large format, it's obviously very expensive. You're paying for a really big negative. You're gonna be in $5, $10, $15 a shot or more. So something worth considering. Whichever format you choose, it's gonna dictate the cost of the film. But what it's also gonna dictate is the cost of development as well. So getting 10 images of large format may cost you $100 to get those developed. Whereas with 35mm, you can get an entire roll developed for $10. So that's worth knowing as well. If you're brand new at photography, you might wanna stick to the smaller formats just because it's more inexpensive. The next step in the process is picking the right film. With film photography, there are a number of choices that need to be made when picking the right film. You got really slow speed films like Velvia, which are gonna have really small grain and yield really high image quality. You've also got really high speed films as well, like Portra 800 or Ilford Delta 1600. Those are higher speed films. The way they achieve that is through larger grain size, which makes for easier shooting in the dark or low light situations, but the grain size is bigger. That's how they make these films able to shoot in lower light. So the grain is gonna be larger and more noticeable. There are a number of different film types, but the 3 most important ones that you need to know are black and white. Obviously, you look at the images, you put black and white film in your camera, you're gonna get black and white images out. There's also color negative film, which is gonna yield wider dynamic range and the ability to kind of recover more of your highlights and shadows. The ability to push or pull the film is greater. And then you've also got slide film, and that's what we talked about with Velvia. Slide film produces a positive image and it typically has less dynamic range. So all those things are worth knowing. And if you're just starting out in film photography, I would recommend starting with black and white or color negative film. People love Portra 400, but if you're just starting out, Kodak Gold 200, Fuji Superior 400, 200, those are great films. Really flexible and not gonna mess you up. So let's talk about cameras. Digital photography, there's basically just 2 types of cameras, SLRs and modern mirrorless cameras. With film photography, there's all manner of types of cameras, and you're gonna have to decide what camera you want. And basically what this amounts to is, do you want more automation or not? I'm gonna go ahead and assume that if you're just getting into film photography, you're gonna wanna start with 35mm as your format, and I made a whole video breaking this down, but I broke it down into 4 basic types of 35mm cameras. Starting with the cheapest, which are disposable cameras. You can still get these at Walmart. They're $15, $20. Fuji makes them, Kodak makes them, and they're really great options because everything is done for you. These cameras are basically automatic, so that's really cool. Then the next step up from that is what I'm gonna call point and shoots. And they make all manner and styles of point and shoots as well, ranging from, again, just a step above disposables, plastic, fantastic. Ilford makes these, Double Film makes these, Kodak even has a few. These cameras are injection molded film cameras, and they have a lot more in common with disposable cameras than they do with SLRs or rangefinder cameras. That leads me to the next kind of popular film camera, and that's an SLR. And this is what you've seen if you've seen Black Friday special digital cameras. Most of the technology and the features are very similar. A lot of times these SLR cameras, especially the modern ones, have lots of automatic features, but if you want an older camera, you can also find SLRs from Nikon, Canon, the usual suspects that don't have many features as well. And most folks, when they get into film photography, they love the vintage look, the vintage aesthetic of like a Nikon FM2 or a Canon AE1. And the older film cameras, they do have less features and less automation, but the benefit of that is there's less to go wrong on these cameras. Older film cameras with more electronic functionality, more things to go wrong. So that's where you're gonna be facing a choice. Do you want an older, more retro looking film camera, or do you want something more modern with more electronic conveniences like the Nikon F100 or something of that sort? There is one other kind of camera out there as well, and not as relevant if you're just starting out film photography unless you're a dentist, and that's premium rangefinders. You're talking about your Leicas. They're obviously gorgeous contacts, not really relevant if you're looking to save some money, but it's worth knowing that those kinds of cameras are out there. These are the really good looking, really attractive, classic looking film cameras, but you're gonna be out a little bit of money because these are very desirable. Now that you've decided on a camera of some sort, the most important part of this entire video and the most important thing for you for furthering your film photography or photography career is you have to learn the camera. Whichever camera that you decide to buy, you need to spend some time with it. There are places online where you can find user manuals still. You need to spend some time learning the camera. The more modern you get with the camera, obviously the more features it's gonna have, but the basic functionality of a film camera is gonna be the same. It's gonna all boil down to the exposure triangle. You're gonna be looking at film speed, which you're gonna have picked when you decided on which film that you're gonna shoot. So if you decided on Velvia 50, your film speed is 50. Or if you picked Portrait 800, your speed is gonna be 800. That's unless you decide to over or underexpose the film, but your film speed was selected when you picked your film. Aperture. Different cameras are gonna allow you to set your aperture differently, but most cameras and lenses, you're gonna be adjusting your aperture on the lens. So you're gonna be turning a dial on the lens, that's gonna select your aperture. And what you're controlling here is how much light you let pass through the lens and actually hit the film. And the last thing that you're going to control is the shutter speed. You'll usually select this with a dial on the camera, but that's controlling how quickly the shutter closes and how much light that actually passes through. And it's the balancing act of these three things which basically determine whether your images are going to suck or not. So you need to learn your camera, you need to learn to control it, but it's those three things. There is one other thing in terms of camera control, and that's focus. If having an autofocus camera is something that's important to you, you need to make sure that you're looking out for that when you pick your camera. And with film cameras, there's a number of ways which accurate focus is achieved, from using focusing scales right down to having modern, convenient autofocus functionality. You need to figure out how your camera focuses. Are you lining up images in a rangefinder? You need to figure out how your camera is going to be focusing and learn to do it accurately. There is one critical step with film photography that's not present in digital that stands between you getting your actual images in hand, and that's development. There are basically two ways that you can go about this, and if you're a beginner with all this, I recommend not starting trying to develop your films yourself. That's a whole other can of worms, but it is something that's achievable. But when you're just starting out, send your films to a lab, you'll get the images back, and that way you're not having to learn too many things at once. I use the darkroom for my development, and I can't say that I've been disappointed with a single roll that I've ever sent them. So should you decide to go down the road of developing your films yourself, this isn't an impossible task. Most of them boil down to just having a few chemicals on hand, but it is something that you're gonna have to learn. But that is an option, especially as you get deeper in the hobby. You can save some money and you can save some time if you're able to develop your film yourself. With film photography, just like digital photography, when you get your images back, you may wanna do some finishing touches. Heck, the terms dodge and burn that we use in Photoshop actually came from film photography techniques. So don't be afraid if you have to drop your images into Photoshop to make some final tweaks. A lot of what you're gonna get, your image color, contrast, all that kind of stuff is going to be baked in, although you can enhance it. I would recommend treading lightly with your post-processing techniques and what all you do with your images in Photoshop at the end of the day, because with film, you wanted a film-like look. You wanted a film-like aesthetic. Most of that's going to be baked in. And there's so much more to film photography than what I've covered here, but that should be more than enough to get you started. Let me know in the comments if you think there's something I missed, something big that you think people should know before they decide to go down this path. But if you're looking for a great 35mm camera that isn't going to cost too much money, it's going to have a lot of automatic features, I just made a video about the Nikon F100. Check this video out before you go. As always, guys, thanks so much for watching, and if you wouldn't care before you go, click the subscribe button, and we'll see ya.